In today's video, we're going to be replacing the timing chain, the balance shaft chain, and the water pump on a 2.4 Ecotec motor. And this one came out of a 2015 Chevy Equinox. A couple of the problems that this motor was having, first it had a really bad oil leak from the rear main seal. And typically what happens on these Ecotec motors is GM put a really tiny hole in that intake manifold. It gets clogged. Once that gets clogged, or if it has moisture that freezes up in the winter, it's just going to blow out the rear main seal. The other issue that it had a little bit of chatter coming here from the timing chain. So obviously in our scenario here, because we had the rear main seal and the timing chain, we pulled the motor. If you've never pulled the motor on one of these Ecotec motors, see the link above. I'll show you every single step to get this motor out of a 2015 Chevy Equinox. But depending on which motor you're working on, it's not required to pull the motor. You can also service it in the vehicle. Yes, it's a little bit easier with the motor out, but again, you still can do it on the vehicle on some models. The first thing I want to talk about before we get into removing this timing chain, as you can see down here, this guide is broke, and we have a bunch of pieces down here that were down in the oil pan. When I removed this timing cover off of here, this guide was literally sitting right in here loose and it was broke. If you pull this timing cover off and you have any of these plastic guides broke, you must also remove the oil pan. This is a step that's often not done with a lot of these timing chain jobs. What happens a lot of times when people do these jobs, yes, in this scenario, it didn't jump time and the motor still ran. It was just a little bit noisy. They think, okay, let's just replace all this and then we're good. You can't just skip this step of not finding where all these plastic chunks went. All these chunks are going to get sucked down into that oil pickup on the oil pan. So if you open the side of your timing cover and you got broken pieces like this off any of these guys in here, you must also take the oil pan off the bottom and find these pieces and remove them. So before we go any further, I'm going to show you how to do that here first, because I think this is a step that a lot of people don't do, and it's very important to make sure you do this as well if you have any of these guides broken. Now that we have the pan removed, next thing we're going to do here is remove these 10 mil bolts here so we can pull this out. And this oil screen here is typically where I see a lot of the smaller pieces end up. So we want to make sure we get this off and inspect that. And sometimes you can also see them down in here. So obviously we're going to clean up all this, but for sure make sure you remove this. I believe those are a 10 mil as well. And just kind of wiggle this and kind of gently pry back, and eventually it'll come out of there. Then we're going to inspect down in here. We're going to make sure we find any of that plastic and remove it. Alright, so I don't know if you can pick that up in the video, but right there you can see there's a bunch of that plastic from that guide sitting right there in that screen. And if you don't remove this after you do your timing chain job, all you're going to do is you're going to jam up your screen here. You're not going to be able to pump oil through your motor and you're going to blow it up. So make sure you do this extra step. I see a lot of times where people do reviews on these timing chains where they might do one of these jobs and they say it only lasts 500 miles and it broke again. That's probably not the case on a lot of them. They didn't do this extra step to remove that plastic, and it actually blew up the motor because that screen was plugged. So make sure you inspect this. Alright, so after cleaning out our oil screen here, these were all the pieces that were in there. And there was a couple smaller pieces as well down here that we did remove. This was that larger piece I showed you earlier that we had up there. Then when we look at the bottom of our pan, we can see we can find more pieces here. So the idea here is you're going to look up on your guide and you're going to see how bad it was broke, and you're going to try to match, you know, the pieces down here. Obviously this isn't going to be 100% perfect or accurate, but you're looking at for an idea of how much you broke off on your guide up there, and make sure you remove that same amount of plastic out of your motor. Once you do that, then just clean up all this, install this oil screen back in there, then we should be good to put our pan on there. Alright, so after you get all the pieces cleaned up from both the bottom of the pan and your oil pickup, to get this pan installed, you need to apply a 2 mm bead of sealant around the perimeter of the oil pan and also that oil suction port opening. You don't need to put a lot in there. It's just a 2 mm bead is what the manual calls for. And this is the sealant that I've used many years for a lot of the oil pans that I've done. I really like it. But, you know, again, you can use whatever sealant you want down there. Then the torque on all these oil pan bolts is going to be 18 foot-pounds. And there is a sequence that you need to follow. I'll make sure I give you that on the screen there when you're tightening those. But once you get your oil pan done, then we'll move on to servicing the timing chain. Alright, so moving on to the timing chain, the first thing you want to do is make sure your cylinder 1 is at top dead center, meaning that piston's all the way up. In order to make sure you do this correctly, look over here on the exhaust side. You're going to be at 10 o'clock there on that mark. On this mark here, you're going to be 2 o'clock. And your timing sprocket down here where that sprocket goes, this little key is going to be at 12 o'clock. In addition, if you come up here on the intake lobe or on the intake camshaft lobe here, I'll show you this first one needs to be 5 o'clock. One going to the back here is going to be 7 o'clock. Once you confirm that those look good there and you have a 10, 2, and that's at 12 o'clock, then you confirm you're at top dead center. And now we can begin the process of removing the timing chain. One other comment I want to make real quick on this sprocket, because this is something a lot of people get hung up on. So this is the new GM one that I have here, and you can see that there's a notch out there. That's the 5 o'clock where you're going to align your timing chain. And on these new GM replacements, they also mark the actual sprocket on the outside. And the reason is there's a friction washer right here. So if you see this one here, that's actually a washer covering up that mark. And also, to make things even worse, on some models, there is a little notch on this friction washer that's actually not the correct timing mark. And people think that's the mark they need to look at, and it's not accurate. What you need to do is remove this outside friction washer. That's when you'll see your mark in there. So you have a friction washer on the front side of the sprocket and also on the back side of the sprocket. So you can sometimes use a magnet or a pick to pull that off, but don't get confused on that if you don't see that mark. It should be 5 o'clock right here, and it's going to be behind that friction washer. So right there, you see that magnet? See how it pulled that washer off of there? So we'll take a little pick and we'll gently pull this out. And I'm going to try to reuse these because these are ridiculously expensive. This little thing is 50 bucks and you have 2 of them. So you have the one on the front and you have the one on the back. So now that you see that we removed that washer, you see right here, here's our mark. So again, don't get hung up on that. Just make sure you remove that in order to make sure you're getting the right timing mark in there when you're going to install this. And right there is that mark that you're looking for. Alright, so the first thing we'll do here is remove the tensioner. This is going to be a 32 mil. And just be careful when you're pulling this out. Sometimes these have a tendency to break and you'll lose those springs everywhere. Then remove the upper timing chain guide here, and you just got 2 10 mil bolts on the back here. Just make sure you put something in the number 1 cylinder there, because you don't want to drop these bolts down in there. Then take a 24 mil, put it back here on the exhaust camshaft to hold it in place. Then take an 18 mil on the front here, and we'll loosen up this actuator bolt. And one note here, you need to make sure you replace these bolts because these are a one-time torque to yield bolt. Once you get that removed, then we can slide the exhaust actuator off of there. Then put a vice grip here on the camshaft just to kind of help hold that in place during the process here. Then remove the tensioner guide here, and this is just going to be a 10 mil. And then we'll pull this out through the top. Then remove this access plug, and it's just going to be a 10 mil hex. Then remove these two guide bolts here, so you got a 10 mil here and one in here. And you'll probably need a magnet or something to get this one out of the top. And we're going to have to be careful here on this one because it is broke up there, and I'll show you what that looks like in here in a minute. So we don't want that bolt falling down in your pan. And it probably is not a bad idea to put something down there to make sure it doesn't. And just be careful if your bolt's all chewed up like mine. As you notice, I'm not using an impact on this. I'm gently getting it out of here with a ratchet. You can see there on the end. Look how chewed up that is from that guide breaking, and it chewed away some of that bolt. So just be careful on this top one. We'll remove that bottom one as well. And slide this guide out of the bottom. And there's that broken piece that I showed you earlier there. And there were those other chunks that we also removed from the oil pan. So again, as I mentioned there before, it's very important. If you have any of these cracked, make sure you do the extra step and remove the oil pan. Then we'll remove the intake sprocket over here. So again, put your 24 mil back here. And we'll loosen up this 18 mil bolt on the front. And again, discard this bolt up front here because it's a one-time use bolt. Then we'll remove the intake sprocket here. And we should be able to pull this out. And you're going to have a couple of those castings right here. Just make sure you get around those, then you should be able to pull the chain out. Then install a vice grip over here on this side as well to hold it in place. Then remove the oiler, and this is going to be a 10 mil as well. And just make sure you inspect in there. If you got anything in there, make sure you clean that out. Now we're ready to remove the balance shaft chain here. And if you're not going to be doing this, you could just move on to the timing. But I really highly recommend doing this because you have some of the same problems on this balance shaft chain. And it's hardly no more work since you're already in here. So first remove the tensioner. Then we'll remove these guides. Then remove the chain. Then the last thing down here, I really highly recommend when you get this all removed to do this water pump. And the marks on the water pump don't matter, unlike some of these other sprockets on here. If you don't do it now, what you have to do on this motor, if everything's put back together, there's this special tool right here, it is, that you need to put in here, and you need to lock this in here so the chain doesn't move. And it's kind of a hassle because it's in the back here by the exhaust. So this is really an ideal time to do this. So I'm just going to zip it off here real quick. And to get our water pump out of here, we need to remove this thermostat housing. So there's just a couple 10 mil bolts over here. This engine coolant temperature sensor here, you can remove this if you need access, or just remove it with a wrench. About the only thing I like about this setup is there is a plug right here on the bottom. It's a 13 mil. You can open that up and that'll drain the remaining coolant out of here so this doesn't come rushing out. So we'll first do that and drain the coolant out, remove this, then we'll remove the water pump bolts over here, then our water pump should come out. And after the majority of that drained out, we'll put this plug back in there. And we'll move on to removing the thermostat housing, then our water pump. And if you're going to remove the coolant temp sensor here, it's just going to be an 18 mil. Then we'll remove the 3 10 mil. Just make a note on the install that the longer bolt goes on the bottom. Then we should be able to wiggle this out. And depending on how much coolant you're able to drain out the previous step, you might have a lot more come out here. And to get our water pump out, I'll show you here real quick on the GM new pump that I have. So if you remember when you removed that timing cover, there was that 13 mil bolt in the middle. That's what's going to go right here. So you already removed that. This one here is also going to be over on the timing chain side. We'll remove that in a minute. Then on the front, you're going to have 2 more 13 mil here. So all we need to do is just remove the 2 here, the one on the timing chain side, then these ones in the middle, just leave those be. Then we should be able to wiggle this thing off of here. Then moving on to the install of your new pump, and I'm not going to go through every step here, but I'll give you a couple pointers or things you need to make sure you do. So first, make sure you thoroughly clean up the mating surface over here on your water pump and also on your thermostat. On your new pump, you're going to see this is the GM genuine one. Make sure your O-rings are still installed there, and you're going to make sure you replace the O-rings over here on this thermostat as well. So you have this one that goes into the water pump, and also you have one that goes in here, and also the one up here on the block. So just make sure you replace all of those gaskets as well. Then the torque on our water pump, the 3 13 mil that we just removed, those are going to be 18 foot-pounds. And if you remember, that fourth one, we'll do that later. Once we put our timing cover back on there, that one will also be 18 foot-pounds. Then if for whatever reason you remove these 4 10 mil on the front, those are 89 inch-pounds. But if you get the GM genuine one like this, you shouldn't have to mess with those. Those are already torque to spec. So just make sure you torque these other 13 mil to 18 foot-pounds, and then we should be done with the water pump. Now that we have our water pump installed, moving on to the balance shaft here, and I'm just going to be using all the GM parts here, and I'll put all these in the description if you're interested. There also are other kits out there that you can get, but I typically use the GM ones when I can. And you're going to notice on this new chain, you're going to have a unique color like this one here, and you're going to have 2 other individual black ones like that. So the unique one goes over here on the intake side, a black one here, and a black one down here. And then these sprockets, this one needs to be 12 o'clock. This arrow right here needs to be 6 o'clock. Then the one on the bottom is 6 o'clock as well. So first start over there on the intake side with the unique color. We'll wrap it around that sprocket. So right there you can see the mark. There's the black link in the middle. And come back over here. And again, you're going to have that black mark right there on that arrow. And up here on the water pump, doesn't really matter. So just thread it around the pump. Alright, so double check it. So right there's the 12, right there's the 6. And down here, if you did it correctly, this one should be straight at the 6 o'clock. And there is a mark down there on that balance shaft sprocket as well. And just make sure when you're installing this that the chain rides in that groove there. So we'll start with the upper guide here. And we're not going to tighten all these down yet. We're just going to hand snug them in there initially. Then we'll go back and torque them to spec. Then do the guide over here. And again, make sure it's riding inside that groove. And do the tensioner guide on the bottom here. Then the torque on the guides, the one on the top and the one on the right is going to be 106 inch-pounds. Then the one on the left here where our tensioner goes is going to be 89 inch-pounds. And I believe on some of the older motors they just did 89 inch-pounds for all three of these. But according to the GM manual that I have for the 2015 LEA motor, that is the correct spec for these three guides. And usually on anything plastic like this, I like to do 2 passes like that. So just gently snug it up a little bit on both of them. Then finally install your tensioner and just make sure that pin is still installed because we want to make sure this isn't activated when we install it. You only activate it after you get it installed in here. Then torque both of these bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Then do one final check. Make sure you're 12 o'clock here, 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Once that looks good, then you can release your pin. Then we're done with the balance shaft, and then we'll move on to the timing chain. Moving on to the timing chain, again, I'm going to be using the GM Genuine version here. I'll put links in the description to this as well. We'll start here with the oiler, and if you didn't clean that out like I talked about earlier, make sure you double check that. And in this kit, it's going to come with the oiler and a new bolt here. Then tighten that to 89 inch-pounds. Moving on to the timing chain sprocket, I am going to be replacing it with a new GM one here. Now, this isn't always required. I'm going to be replacing this and both of the VVT sprockets at the top, just because this motor has 150,000 miles. But if you do replace this, don't forget about these little friction washers. So again, you have the one on the front that we removed earlier. Then there's going to be one on the back. So if you pull that out, make sure you still have the one on the back. We'll slide our new sprocket on there, and we'll leave this off for the time being, just so we can align our mark. Once we get that all installed, we'll put this friction washer back in. So we'll gently slide this off and just make sure that key doesn't come out of there. And sometimes that washer's hung up here and I can see it's still back there, so I'm just going to leave it be. And we'll take our new one. Just make sure you're at 5 o'clock there and that's straight up. Before we install our intake sprocket here, one thing I want to explain here real quick is you see these notches on both sides here. Depending on which motor, those are going to be oriented different. So on this LEA is the one I have here. You're going to have the intake side over here at 10, and then that's going to be at 7. And that should be the same for a few other motor variations. So the LAP, the LE8, the LUK, and the 2011 or newer LAF, they're going to have that orientation. If you have some of the older motors, the LE5, the LE9, the LAT, LNF, LDK, LHU, LTD, LBN, or the 2010 LAF or older, your positions are going to be different. So your intake camshaft is going to be on 5 o'clock on that one, and it's going to be at 7 o'clock on the exhaust. So just make sure you're paying attention to that. Again, this is the 2015 LEA that we took out of an Equinox, so our orientation is correct on both our exhaust and our intake camshafts. Alright, so now that we've verified those are correct, the other thing to pay attention is that notch there is going to go in there on both your intake and your exhaust. And as I mentioned there before, also make sure you're replacing these bolts. So starting over here on the intake side, just make sure your mark on your sprocket is on the uniquely colored one here. And we're going to drop our chain down there. Make sure you get across those engine bosses where it's on the outside. Then again, make sure you line up that notch on your sprocket to the camshaft. Just make sure it gets fully seated in there. And if you have it still lined up correctly, you should be at 2 o'clock here. Then we'll take our new bolt, and we're not going to tighten this up all the way. We're just going to put this in there to kind of hold it in place. Then come down here on your timing chain sprocket and just make sure that black link there is lined up at 5 o'clock on our sprocket, just like that. And if that looks good, then we'll take this guide and we'll thread it down through here. Then we'll take our bolt that came with the kit, and again, we'll just hand tighten this for now. And again, just like we did on all these other guides, make sure your chain is riding on the center inside both of the grooves on that guide. Next, take your exhaust sprocket. Again, there's your mark, and then you're going to line it up on that black mark. And don't forget about the notch here, it goes in here. Now, depending on how this is oriented, sometimes you get lucky and you can slide it right in there. Other times you need to loosely put this on there. Don't have that engaged yet. Once you have it sitting on there, then slightly rotate the camshaft or the exhaust camshaft right here to align it. But it looks like ours might just go in right away here. We'll see. So I can feel it sitting in there, but it's not fully seated. If you come back over here, see how that one's flat? So we need to gently rotate it. Alright, so just make sure it's fully seated, and now you can see that's not moving, so then we'll put our bolt in. Alright, so after you get those both hand tightened, don't torque them down yet. Just again verify that you're in the 10, the 2, and down here this mark on that chain on the bottom is at 5. Alright, so after you verify all your timing marks are correct, we'll tighten up this guide right here to 89 inch-pounds. And again, just make sure that your chain is riding on the inside of those ridges. And then install your guide over here on the other side. And just be careful during this step that you don't accidentally drop this bolt down into your pan. Then torque both of these bolts to 106 inch-pounds. Then we'll reinstall this friction washer on the bottom. And ideally, it's probably best to replace that, but as I mentioned there earlier, for $50 a piece and you need 2 of them, just make sure you clean it off a little bit and it should be fine. Then reinstall this access bolt, and again, that's just going to be a 10 mil hex in there. And just make sure you put a little sealant on those threads, and the torque on this is going to be 55 foot-pounds. Moving on to the tensioner. Now, one thing you need to pay attention to here is if you look inside there, you're going to see that little notch on there, and I'll try to give you a close-up here. If you look in there, that little notch on that tensioner guide, you need to make sure you align that with your tensioner. So if you look in there, those 2 flat pieces in there, so if you look at your tensioner, you're going to see that top part. See that little groove on both sides? It needs to go in like this. If you aligned it in like that, it's going to be incorrect. Now, what's going to happen when you start tightening this in there, it will gently rotate, but eventually it should snap in place. So just verify. It's going to be hard for me to show you down in there with the camera angle, but you do have a little bit of access to look up top. So just make sure you're aligning that. And then we're going to tighten the tensioner to 55 foot-pounds. And one other comment, just make sure it's in the deactivated state. We'll have to activate it after we get it installed. All right, so then we'll set this in here, and then we'll install our tensioner. And again, we'll torque this to 55 foot-pounds. All right, so I can see it just snapped in place. So let me see if I can give you a quick picture of this. Alright, so there's the 55 foot-pounds. Next, install the upper timing chain guide here, and then you're going to torque these bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Alright, so there's the 89 inch-pounds. Then to activate our tensioner, get something that's flat. Ideally it's rubber, but I've used this breaker bar many times over the years. And you're going to go in there where that chain's at, and you're going to rest it up against right where that tensioner's at. And we're going to give it a gentle tap on the other side, and you should hear it snap, then it should draw the tension in. Then just come over here and just verify that that tensioner did come out a little bit, and we can see that it did there. So we verified that tensioner is now activated. So then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to torque these 2 bolts up here. And the torque on these is going to be 22 foot-pounds plus an additional 100 degrees. And again, just take your 24 mil wrench on the back side to hold it there while you're torquing it to spec. Alright, so there's the 22 foot-pounds, so then just do an additional 100 degrees. And GM does make a tool for this to hold the camshaft back here, but as long as you get a wrench on there, you should be able to hold it there tight. Alright, so that should be good enough. Then the last thing we'll do here is we're going to replace these VVT solenoids. One call out here is you need to make sure you're putting them in the right orientation. So they're going to have an INT for the intake. So your intake's going to be over here. Then you're going to have an exhaust over here. Some of the older ones, you can see that they're both black, but they do have the marks on them. If you look at one of these newer ones, or any of the newer parts that you're going to get anymore, you should have different colors. So just make sure you're putting the exhaust one over here and the intake one up front. And these bolts are just going to be an 8mm. Just make sure you put something in that cylinder hole there, because you don't want any of these bolts to fall down in there. And if you have any dirt debris there, just make sure you use a shop vac real quick here. And just gently clean up that hole there. And take your new one. Just make sure that O-ring's installed there. And you're doing the intake, so we'll be on this side first. So just wiggle it down in there. And do the same thing over here on the exhaust side. Then we're going to tighten both of these bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Alright, so after you get those VVT solenoids installed, we're done with the complete timing chain, the balance shaft, and the water pump. The last thing you need to do here is just install some of this stuff on the front. So make sure you get a new front timing cover gasket. So here's the part number, and again, I'll put links in the description to this. And you're going to tighten all those timing cover bolts to 18 foot-pounds, including that larger 13mm here. If you remember, that goes into the water pump, so that's the fourth bolt that's going to hold the water pump in place. Then after you get the front cover installed, put your harmonic balancer on there, and that's going to be torqued to 111 foot-pounds plus an additional 100 degrees. Then finally do your tensioner, and then this one's going to be 33 foot-pounds. Alright, well hopefully this video helped you out. If you're curious on what you had to do to service the timing chain and the balance shaft chain on one of these Ecotec motors, if it did, please give me the thumbs up. If you're interested in more content like this, please hit that subscribe. But again, I hope this helped you out, and thanks for watching.